and I'm about to make you the leader, the host. You ready?
Uh, sure.
Have you been host before? Or would you rather have me stay here and host
You
for
might
you?
as well stay as host because I
Okay.
don't really have the controls on my iPad.
All right. I will
Gonna-
stay as host. You just won't see my face because I'll continue working, but I'll keep my headset on.
All right, thank you. So welcome everyone to the League of Women Voters of Colorado Climate Emergency Task Force meeting. My name's Elaine Rideout, and today's topic is regenerative agriculture. So the Climate Emergency Task Force will also be sponsoring future monthly presentations on a variety of environmental topics such as microplastics, water, transportation, climate migration. Our next presentation, for your information, is going to be November 30th. It's going to be a Zoom, which will feature Colorado legislators discussing potential environmental legislation for the upcoming 2024 session. So that's your chance to hear what they have to say, ask questions, and provide them your feedback. So hopefully you'll tune in for that. You can check the Colorado League calendar for all our task force meetings. Task force is always open to league members throughout the state. If you can't make that commitment to beyond the task force, but you want to support climate action, you can leave your name and email in the chat and we'll add you to the task force mailing list. So you'll get future reminders of presentations, but most importantly, you'll keep informed about actions to address climate change issues. The task force members have taken collective action on various state legislations, from plastics to pollinators. We absolutely need everyone's voice in support of effective and equitable climate solutions. So back to today's topic, regenerative agriculture. If you don't know what it is, you're going to find out, as well as what's have to do with climate change and growing food while restoring natural processes. So regenerative practices go beyond sustainability. They don't just sustain the planet's health by reducing harm, they improve the level of health. So you're going to find out what you and the League can do to support a food production system that's part of the climate solution. So we have two individuals here today from Green America. Christy Schwengel has worked for Green America for 16 years, and she's going to tell you a little bit about the organization and then introduce Jessica, who's going to be today's speaker. So please stay on mute throughout the presentation. Put any questions you'd like or comments in the chat. We'll get to those at the end. And I thank you all for tuning in today. So Christy, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Elaine. I come from an active League of Women Voters family, so I'm very excited to be here today. And I know people in the League get things done in the world. I've grown up around League members my whole life. I especially want to thank you for prioritizing our climate and having a climate emergency task force. As we all know, the climate crisis is one of the greatest challenges of our time. Green America has been working on climate and social justice issues for over 40 years. We're a national nonprofit organization focused on creating a green economy. So we know every time people spend $1, it goes to work in the world. And it can go to work for good or go to work for bad. Whether you're deciding where to invest your retirement savings or you're just trying to decide which chocolate bar to buy. So we help inform people's choices, organize consumers and investors, and bring together businesses and other stakeholders to create a more sustainable supply chain. And our goal is a more just and sustainable society. We really think one of the most promising solutions to the climate crisis is regenerative agriculture. So on that hopeful note, I'm excited to introduce one of our regenerative agriculture experts, Jessica Hull-Stillen. Jessica is our director of the Soil and Climate Alliance, and she's been with Green America for 7 years. And coincidentally, she is from Colorado. So after Jessica's talk, we'll take some questions and we'd be happy to follow up with anyone wanting more information or to engage further in our work. I did put our website in the chat. It's greenamerica.org. And Jessica and I would be happy to follow up afterwards with any questions. So with that, let me turn it over to Jessica.
Well, thank you so much, Christy. Thank you, Elaine, and thank you to all for this invitation. regenerative agriculture is one of my favorite things to talk about. The second of my favorite things to talk about is food, and those are inextricably linked. And it is so wonderful to be talking to you all from across Colorado. I was born at Boulder General. I finished high school at Eagle Crest High School in Aurora. I am also a fourth generation small grains farmer in Colorado. My family's farm is just outside of Fleming, which is, for those of you who don't go all the way up into the northeastern corner, we're about halfway between Sterling and the Nebraska state line. So this is near and dear to my heart, personally, professionally, sort of bringing all of it together. So let's really dive into this. As Elaine and Christy have said, if you have questions, please drop them in the chat. If it's something I've just said, I'll try to grab it and sort of weave it into my answer. And if not, we will absolutely get to your questions at the end. As much as I love to talk about regenerative agriculture, I want to make sure that you all walk away knowing what you want to know, learning what you want to learn, and really being able to take all of what we're about to talk about and make it very, very actionable. So I've got a couple of slides that I'll put up in just a minute, but the first thing that I want to start with is regenerative agriculture. You hear a lot of buzzwords. You hear organic, you hear non-GMO. Regenerative is very, very different because we are talking about a whole system shift. And that system is what is going to affect the climate. It's what's gonna affect the quality of our food. It's what's gonna allow farmers to stay on their land. So we are talking whole system wide from top to bottom. So just really keep that in mind as we get started. So give me 1 second while I just put up a couple of slides to share with you guys, because I personally am a visual learner. So what is regenerative? It is this whole system approach to agriculture that includes a wide range of practices that focus on soil health, that focus on restoring the climate, focus on ensuring farm prosperity. And when we say a range of practices, what that means is this is not a binary standard like the non-GMO, you are or you aren't. It's not a practice-based tick box system like organic. Both of those are fabulous. We began in the non-GMO space, we're moving forward from there, but we are looking at identifying what works in a particular, at a particular farm, in a particular field. So when we talk about regenerative, you hear a lot of words in agriculture. You hear conventional ag, sometimes that's phrased as chemical agriculture, non-GMO, which really has to do with the seed, organic, regenerative, organic, biodynamic. All of that is regenerative because regenerative is the idea that the practices you're using are building the soil health, are building the resiliency, and really strengthening the system from within. And so when we talk about sort of these three big buckets, soil resiliency, of restoring the climate, of farm prosperity, what we're talking about is working across this whole system to bring these together. Now, soil resiliency is fabulous because soil resiliency is what not only is what we're really talking about, what we're really getting at with regenerative agriculture, because what we're trying to do is make the soil healthy again. We're trying to make the soil is a living, breathing thing. It's not just dirt, it's not just sand. If we empower our soil, if we take care of our soil is going to take care of us. So what we're really looking at there is a lot of issues around biodiversity. We're looking at and what that looks like above soil, what that looks like below soil. Below soil is where it gets really fun. And that really ties into both food and national security, which comes into play in so many ways. When we're talking about, before this call started, a couple of us were on early and we're talking about the fact that I'm based in Northern California. It's 92 degrees here today. That is way too warm for late October. It's causing cropping problems in the Central Valley. That's going to affect the food supply. Now, when you have soil that can take care of itself, it can mitigate those factors. It can mitigate heat, it can mitigate cold, it can mitigate too much water, it can mitigate not enough water. And that's where we're looking at food security. That's where we're looking at national security, because we're able to grow food to feed our citizens. It's a really big issue. I'm sure we're all keeping track of what's in the news this week, last week, next week, and it's so touch and go. This is a really big issue that we want to focus on. Now, when we start talking about the climate aspect of regenerative, because you can talk, what's also really beautiful about regenerative is these are all practices, these are all outcomes that we all agree on. And it doesn't matter what approach you're taking, it doesn't matter what you think is the right outcome. You could be into regenerative agriculture for the climate aspect. That's great. You could be in it for the soil health aspects. Fantastic. For the water quality, great. Because it's the same package that is going to bring us all together. So when we're talking about the climate aspect, we're talking about that healthier soil that we're growing. That healthier soil is drawing down carbon. I'm of the generation that we started with Earth Day back in the early 90s, and we learned that we plant trees because trees pull carbon dioxide out of the air and they turn it into oxygen for us. And that's great. Plants do the same thing. And the more plants we have, the more of that drawdown they can do. And the healthier those plants are, they don't just draw it down into the plant, they draw it all the way down into the roots, into the soil. And it's really helping us to do a couple of things simultaneously. So we're getting that carbon out of the air, very good thing. We're feeding these plants because this is what they eat. And then we're feeding the soil. So it's really this beautiful symbiotic relationship that we're building. And what that builds as we move forward is we're looking at this economic success for farmers. And that is so, so key, because we all know who grows our food. It's the farmers that grow our food. They are out there all weather, hot, cold, rainy, dry. I was talking to one of our great farmers in Nebraska, and he was both complaining to me and really happy. They're getting rain today. He's like, oh, it's such a bummer. Harvest is delayed. At the same time, I really need rain because they've just planted next year's wheat crop and they need that. So it's this push and pull for farmers. So what they're really looking at is how do they continue to thrive with the change in climate, with the change in weather, with all of these different pieces that we see happening. So these pieces all really come together to create this amazing system. Now I'm going to stop sharing these slides. Okay, those are down. So when we're talking about agriculture in this country, we're talking about 1 billion acres. There's 1 billion domestic agricultural acres that are being cultivated as we speak. They're in row crops, they're in animal production, they're in fruits and veg. This is the whole system. And from those 1 billion acres, it's estimated, depending on whose numbers you believe, USDA, World Resource Institute, there's a little variation there, somewhere between 11 and 20% of all greenhouse gases come from our agricultural system, our domestic agricultural system. And so when you look at those numbers, you see both the cause of some of these these greenhouse gases, some of this climate work, but you also see this amazing opportunity because those acres then also have the ability to reverse that climate change, to bring down that carbon. The latest estimates we've seen is that 1 billion, let me get the statistic right because I always get it wrong. About 1 billion pounds of greenhouse gases per year could be drawn down if we advance all of our domestic agricultural lands into regenerative. I've given you a lot about regenerative there, sort of as a very broad case. When we're talking about regenerative, again, we're not talking tick boxes. We're not saying, okay, you do step 1, step 2, step 3, you're regenerative. That's where regenerative gets really complicated. And that's where we need you folks to really help us take up this call to action that we have around moving acres to regenerative. Because when we're talking about a regenerative transition, that's the way you're often hear it phrased. The way we talk about it's how a lot of our partners do. We're talking about a regenerative transition because we're talking about moving from a conventional system, from a very chemical heavy, very mechanistic, very extractive farming techniques to these techniques that are more holistic, that are more in tune with what the soil needs. And there is no one answer because the soil in Boulder is going to be different than the soil in Pueblo, than the soil in Sterling. Even within a county, you can have different soil on different farms. So we're Where we need to shift our thinking and shift our support is to reteaching farmers, what is soil supposed to look like? How do we dig into this soil quite literally? How can you dig into the soil and look at your soil and say, well, this is what you need and this is how we're working. And so when we start talking about regenerative transition, that's exactly what we're talking about. Is we're talking about farmers, farms, farm workers, all of the people involved in the system getting back in touch with that soil. Say, there are some tests you can do by touching soil, by digging in soil. I know some people that lick soil. I personally don't recommend that because it's soil. But there's also some lab tests you can do and really understand what is your soil, just the same way when we go to the doctor, they take your blood and they're like, oh, great. Well, your liver looks good, your kidneys look good, all of these different elements look good. But this, I have low blood pressure. The genetic thing, it's just sort of there. But they go in and they look at it and they're like, okay, so this, you have low blood pressure. So this is what we need to do. So there's soil tests they can do and say, well, this, your proteins look good, your soil respiration looks good. But you know what? You don't have enough sodium in your soil. Sodium in your soil, just like sodium in a person, totally same thing. So let's talk. So then, okay, great. You know what you don't have enough of. And then it's really identifying what practices do you need to address that issue. Now, for people who've been hearing a lot about climate, who've been hearing a lot of agriculture, a lot of practices get thrown around. You'll hear things like no-till, which is, digging into the soil and really breaking up the soil, which is not a great thing to do. You hear a lot about cover crops. You hear a lot about putting in more trees, putting in more, putting animals back on pasture. All of these are regenerative practices. Anything that you can do that really is bringing your land, if you think about what prairie land was like 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 400 years ago, that's the state we're trying to get land back to with regenerative practices. Knowing that we've made some advancements, we know a little bit more about the science. We know a little bit more about how to address some of these things. But that's really where we're coming into this, is how do we get this land to look more like it did when my great-grandparents were farming at the turn of 2 centuries ago? How do we get it back to where my grandparents were farming after my grandpa came back from World War II and got a bunch more land? Thank you, GI Bill. We appreciated that. It's how do we bring this back to that point while still creating the quantities that we need to feed folks? So that's really where we're coming at all of this from, is looking at the different opportunities we have for land and then translating that into you great people and all of the consumers out there. Because yes, we can transition farmers. We can help them understand their land better. We can help them understand their practices better. But if there's nowhere for that product to go, then we're missing part of what is necessary to drive this forward. And when Christy introduced me to you all, she said that I'm the director of the Soil and Climate Alliance. And that's exactly what we're focused on at the Soil and Climate Alliance, is connecting that supply chain. Working with farmers is one of my favorite parts of my job, but supporting their work, supporting their product to move through the system and end up on grocery shelves, end up at farmers markets. That's what we're really focused on. And that's why I was so grateful that you all reached out and asked me to talk about this, because connecting what the farmers are growing, what the consumers are buying, is really the driver for all of this work, and is really how we move this system forward to address the climate emergency that you all are so apt in addressing, and to address all of these pieces that we know are happening. And that's a lot of that is, and making that connection is one of the big barriers in transitioning this system overall, for a couple of reasons. One is because, and I think we saw this over the pandemic, our supply chains are very used to operating in a very prescribed way, and deviate from that prescribed way, they get very confused. But we're addressing that. And another is an idea that people think food should be cheap. And that's a problem, because if you talk to farmers, growing food isn't cheap. So why should food be cheap? And really, so there's a lot that we need to do to really addressing both of those issues. And a lot of that can be done by consumers standing up and saying, we want better food. And what's great, and we're already starting to see this through consumer surveys, through a lot of different mediums, is that consumers are saying that they want food that is higher quality. They are saying that they want food from farms that are healthier, from farms where farmers are paid not just a living wage, but a sustainable wage for them to do the hard work that we're doing. So some of that work is already happening, but we really want to advance more of that work. We really want to bring more of that to the forefront. And so when we start talking about moving, these regenerative products through the system onto these shelves, a lot of people say, well, how are we supposed to know that it's regenerative? Which is a huge barrier, because you can't just assume because something's more expensive, it's better for you. And so that is another place where our work, and Christy, could I ask you to drop the link to the Soil Carbon Initiative in the chat for me? Thank you so much. So there are a number of labels coming out which are going to help consumers identify where they're getting these more regenerative foods. I'm going to tell you about the one that we've created, and then I'll tell you about the ones that we haven't created but have been partners in, because you guys are going to start seeing these pop up on food brands early next year. It's really, really exciting that we're making this progress. But we're starting to see more and more on-pack labels in development that are going to let consumers know when the food they're buying is regenerative. The one Christy just dropped, the Soil Carbon Initiative, is what our network has created, what the Soil and Climate Alliance has created in partnership with 50 farmers, 50 soil scientists, 25 brands, have all come together to really create this label. And if you click on that link, you're going to see the really beautiful label art that you will see by the end of March of 2024 popping up on some select brands, with the goal to move it forward. And things like that are, when you're shopping, you can start to look for some of these labels. We all know the non-GMO butterfly. We all know the organic label. Those are great indicators. This is the Soil Carbon Initiative. There's also going to be one called, and dear Lord, don't ask me what it stands for, but it's called EOV, Environmental Something Verification. They're going to have a label out, regenerative organic certified. You may have seen that out in the world. That's a really fabulous one. That's a little bit further than just regenerative, because it's regenerative organic. You're going to see a couple of those labels popping up, but that's when you can really start looking at what is on your food packaging. What are you seeing out there that is indicating where this food has come from, that's going to help you to make those choices. Now, the flip side of that is, take your favorite product. You pick it up, you look at it, it doesn't have any labels showing that it's organic, showing that it's regenerative, any of these things. Write to the food company, call the food company, tell them you want to see those better products or those better ingredients in your food, because if there's one thing that brands listen to, it's their consumers, because we're the ones out there buying their products. And if we poke them enough, if we say, we want to see this quality, we want to see this trait in our food, they're going to respond, and they're going to reach back into their supply chain and figure out how to do it. You're seeing a lot of big food brands. Just today, Walmart and General Mills committed to transitioning 100 million acres into regenerative production. Well, that's about a tenth of the 960 million domestic ag acres I talked to you about. So that's a great start. And especially if they are committed to that, if they do it, if they time bind it, we could start to see some real progress there. But we still need to move those other 900 million acres. So there's a lot of pressure that can be put on consumers, a lot of pressure, or you are the consumers, a lot of pressure that can be put on brands. Those are the ones we want to put pressure on. Consumers, we're under enough pressure right now. I think we all know that when we go to the grocery store every week. So that's a really big part of it. And then the second part of it is coming at this and talking about, how do we transition these acres? How do we support our farmers? Is, I think, what is probably a superpower of you all is really working with your elected officials, state, local, federal, talking to them about what we want to see from our agricultural system. We all know about the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill is a good piece of legislation. It's in a little bit of a pause right now. There's a lot of work that we can be doing with state bills. I know a lot of counties are doing some amazing work around water quality, around how to support farmers. That's where we can focus a lot of our energy, and talking to legislators, talking to consumers about how do we bring these two pieces together. Joanne, I love this question. This is such a great question. Packaging is a huge piece of this. And I'm going to be totally honest, I don't know a ton from a professional sense, but I do know a little bit from my personal sense, because I agree with you. When we need to use packaging, let's make it compostable. Let's make it recyclable. This really comes into play when we're talking about supply chains, because in order to move packaged food like produce you can generally move unpackaged. You don't need to pre-bag apples. I've seen bananas shrink wrapped before, which kind of defeats the entire purpose of a banana, because it's got a peel, you take it off, the banana's good to go. But yeah, that's a big piece about packaging, and a lot of work is happening in that space. But that's another thing when you're talking to companies and you're saying, hey, I love your pasta, but I wish you sold it in a recyclable, cardboard box instead of a not recyclable plastic bag. So there's a lot happening there. There's also a lot that can be done there around transportation issues to reduce the amount that is being transported, which reduces the use of gas, which reduces the use of greenhouse gas emissions from burning those gases. So that's a really great question. Another thing to do is, on times when you do need those plastic bags, just like Joanne says, take your own. They're fun. On the occasions that maybe you accidentally, like I, forget your bags when you go to the farmer's market or the grocery, and you have to get the plastic bags for, so your limes don't roll everywhere, reuse them. You can reuse those bags for ages. You can turn them into all sorts of things. So that's a great question. And again, that's all part of looking at this as a regenerative system. We can care about the food in the package. We can care about the package around the food. We can care about the transportation that is used to get the food from the farm to the factory to the grocery store. And the more that we can push on all of those elements is a bigger and better way for us to change the system as a whole, and to get people thinking all about those pieces. The other big piece that I would say is keep asking questions. Ask questions of my grocery store. They love me because we get a new product and I walk in there and I find the store manager and I ask them 6 questions about it. And they're like, Jessica, I don't know. I'm like, well, let's find out. Let's research this product. Let's dig into it. Let's find out who made it. When you're talking store brands, every grocery you go into now has their own store brand, their own company brand. Those are great. Find out who's processing them, because a lot of times the company that's actually processing them is a big name brand. They're just processing and putting a different label on this. And if you can track that back, you can put even more pressure onto these food companies to look at their sourcing. I feel like I've said a lot, and I'm really curious as to what questions you all might have before I sort of move into the second part of this. If anyone wants to drop in the chat or raise your hand, otherwise I can keep sort of really diving into what we're talking about. Go for it, Sandy.
I am a little unclear as to how to determine how do they determine whether somebody is doing regenerative agriculture?
Awesome question. So there's a couple ways. And when I was mentioning the Soil Carbon Initiative, which we've launched, that is a transition program. So what we're doing there is, let's imagine you've got a field. For years, you've been growing wheat in this field, and you really want to understand what's going on in your field. So there's a soil test called the Haney Soil Test, created by a very, very smart man called Dr. Rick Haney, formerly of the USDA, now is semi-retired and runs a lab in Kansas that we work with. And you run a soil health test, and you see, that's the test I was talking about. You sort of see where your soil health is. And from there, you identify what your soil needs to improve itself. And then you make a plan. Most most farm plans are multi-year because it's farming. Weather can affect it, seed shortages, all sorts of things can affect the land. So you develop your soil health plan and then you move through it. And as you're going, you look at the soil, you look at its color, you look at what's growing from it, and you use those to assess soil as you're moving forward. And so being regenerative is both a state of mind, which is a really weird thing to say, but is also a process. So it's not just like, okay, you've changed these two things, you're regenerative. Being a regenerative farmer, growing regenerative products is a continual plan. We work with this amazing regenerative farmer in Indiana, Rick Clark. He's got about 7,000 or 8,000 acres now, and he's been doing this for 17 years. He still says he's not regenerative yet. He's like, no, there's more I need to do. There's more I need to experiment with. It's really this idea of farmers being the experts on their soil, being the experts on their land, and knowing what it needs any given year. General regenerative practices, Gail, that's a great question. And I've mentioned some of that. Cover crops. Cover crops is usually when you plant crops. You may see this a lot in Colorado. You drive past fields, it's the height of summer, everything around it, you've got corn and wheat up to your eyes, and it's a bare field. That's a fallow field. That means that field has just kind of been left to rest, but you don't really let soil rest. You always want to have something in it, growing in the soil, standing above the soil, because that's what protects it. And so that's the idea with cover crops, is you can put a crop out there. It's usually not something you're going to harvest for a cash crop, is what they refer to as a cover crop. You can also grow a lot of different things and turn them into animal feed. You can let animals, you can still cut it down and let the animals eat it. You can also just flatten it down. You can run over it there's different machines, or you can just kind of let it winter kill, and it'll fall and protect the top of that soil. So cover cropping is one of the most common practices that you'll hear about as a regenerative practice. You'll also hear a lot about no-tilling or low-tilling, which tilling refers to when you disrupt the surface of the soil. Just disrupting the surface, like the top couple inches, that's not that big of a deal. It's when you get down, below about 6 inches and really start churning it up, and that's just going to kill everything that's in your soil. So that's another practice. You will also see, in terms of practices, you will see folks that plant more trees and more bushes around their fields to provide protection, which also protects the soil. It also brings wildlife back onto that land, which is a good thing. A lot of people are like, no, we've got to keep animals off the land. You actually want some animals on the land, because if they come back to the land, that means there's something there for them to eat. And it's really about creating this very symbiotic ecosystem. You want the bugs underground, you want the worms, you want, bunnies and gophers and birds sort of all traipsing across the land, which again, some farmers I would say this to, and it would make their heart stop. So like, well, they're going to eat all of my crops. A bunny is not going to eat that much of your crop, I promise. When you get into more advanced practices, it's when you bring animals back onto the land. So you'll see in fully integrated operations, you will often see, farmer goes out, harvests the wheat, harvests the corn, harvests the soy. Then they move the cows or the goats or the sheep onto that land, and they let them trample around. They let them eat what's left on there. They aerate the soil with their hooves. They fertilize as they go. You're using animals to do this work that's really necessary to turn over the soil. Alice, I love this question. The cost to the farmer to go regenerative. So we have, and if anybody's interested in this, Christy will drop my email into the chat when we're done. Please reach out to me. We have a whole presentation on this that I would love to share with you. We have about 15 years of farmer economic data, like their books. We have our farmers, they send us the books every year. Farmers actually, when they go regenerative, they spend a lot less and they make more, which ends up really in their favor. What usually catches most farmers and why most farmers are really scared to go regenerative is two financial reasons. One being, most American farmers are living harvest to harvest. They have a big operating loan. Their goal is to grow as much of their crop so they can sell it for whatever the highest price so they can pay off that operating loan. And if they miss that, they run the risk. You know, we have a lot of farmers that are, can you guys still hear me okay? Okay, great. I got a weird message on my screen. We have, we have a lot of farmers in this country that are generational farmers. We also have a lot of farmers that are trying this for the first time and are scraping together every last penny they can to do this. And so when we're talking about transitioning practices from a very, we're going to use the term reliable very loosely, but from a standard plant, grow, harvest, sell to a, well, you're going to plant and you're going to hope it grows and you're going to hope it harvests for those few years that you're doing these changes in practices, because it can affect your yield. There's an educational piece to learning. So farmers can see a little bit of yield loss, which is why there's a lot of programs, federal programs, state programs, private programs to help farmers not only with that educational piece, but also with some of that economic piece to get through that transition. And so that the other piece of that is when farmers go regenerative. I was talking about cover crops. Let's say you start putting your crops into rotation. So one year you're growing corn. The next year you've got wheat on this land. The next year you've got barley on this land. You're growing more crops. So you have a crop every year, but it's a different crop. But what the beauty of that is let's say one of those crops fails. You have a nasty hailstorm, it comes through, it takes out your corn. Well, you're going to have another crop coming up behind it. So you're creating additional, we say enterprises, but you're creating additional sources of income within that same set of land, which are going to over time become more and more reliable. So that's really where the cost comes to farmers. Let's see. I'm going to jump to this question on urban farmers. Joanne, I am going to come back to your question on packaging. Regenerative farmers for urban, or regenerative practices for urban farmers are sort of the same practices that you can do for large scale farmers. You're just doing it a little bit smaller. You're still looking at how do you build that soil health under the soil? How many different types of crops can you grow in that same soil that are going to contribute to the nutrients of that soil, that are going to contribute to the sustainability of that soil? Tillage is going to be a little bit less of a problem in urban settings, depending on what you're growing. Mycelium is critical in soil. This is one of the things that we're often measuring for. So that's a really great thing to focus on when you're looking at those soil tests. If anybody wants to learn more about the soil tests, about what we're measuring, about what we're looking at, again, reach out to me, let me know. Would love to talk more in depth about that and to refer you to my colleague who reads soil tests for a living and translates them for our farmers, because that's a really key part of this. Back up to the question on packaging. The question, this comes back to the question that we all ask is, who has the ability to make these changes? Who has the ability to put pressure on? We do. We're the consumers. We're the ones that buy them. Writing them is great. If you're on social media is a great way to go after them, because they see it instantly. They're able to pass things along instantly. Anyone who is involved in sustainability within these companies, you can even, bringing it up to your store manager, it's a little helpful. Those folks generally don't have a lot of direct impact on these things, but they can certainly pass things up the line. But go online, look up who's the chief sustainability officer, because every company has a chief sustainability officer. Go after them. Call their offices, email them, really reach out and make yourself a known quantity to them, so that they know that when people reach out on this issue, there's a group behind this. In terms of, you guys have the best questions. I love these. Farm equipment. Farm equipment is another one of those economic barriers, because oftentimes you do need a new piece of equipment to incorporate a new cropping system. Now, that said, if you guys know farmers love to support each other. And if one farmer has something that another farmer needs, most likely they're going to share, they're going to help each other out. We've been looking at a number of programs that buy equipment and sort of treat it like a lending library. You know, it's kind of weird to think about lending a combine or a tractor out, but that's exactly what some of these groups are doing. You can also, there's also farmers that if you, actually one of our farmers needed a heavier piece of equipment for planting. He couldn't afford a new piece of equipment. So he went out, he got Rubbermaid tubs, he filled them with cement, he put them on his current piece of equipment. There you go. Farmers are ingenious. They think about these things, and there's a lot of help. There's a lot of farmers who've done this and are willing to help each other and put, you know, if you're talking to a farmer and they're like, oh, I don't know how to do this. The answer is usually YouTube. There is a farmer out there who has done this, who has filmed a video and is sharing out what they've done and how they've done it. How do you lower the mechanization of farming? You go regenerative. Because farming will always, in some way, you know, there will always be mechanics involved in farming. You need it to plant, you need it to harvest. The beauty of regenerative is when you're talking about reducing your inputs, when you're talking about reducing having to apply chemicals, to apply manure, to apply fertilizer, it means you're using less, you're running your machines less, you're using less of that equipment to get it done, which again comes back to we're burning less fossil fuels, we're putting less greenhouse gases up into the air. You're really moving the whole system along. That said, you're always, you know, we don't want farmers to have to go back to harvesting by hand. We don't, you know, I have pictures of my great-grandfather plowing with the mules. That looks like a lot of work. That doesn't look like something I really want to make people do unless that's what they want to do. So there's always going to be a little mechanization, but we can definitely reducing this within their work. Wes, do I think the goals of regenerative agriculture are achievable within capitalism? Yes, for a couple of reasons. One is that there's always going to be, we always are going to have to eat. We're always going to have to feed people. So there's always going to have to be some element of capitalism involved. The other answer to that question is, I'll be totally honest with you guys. I would prefer that every food company decides to start sourcing regenerative ingredients because it's the right thing to do. That's not going to happen. They're going to do it. Kellogg's is going to do it because they want to take market share from General Mills, who's going to do it because they want to take market share from Nabisco, who wants to take market share from somebody else. Okay, let's show them that they're going to make, that these companies are still going to be able to make money if they go regenerative, and then let's let them race to the top. Let's let them try to outdo each other for how regenerative they can be. Let's pit Wheaties versus Cheerios and see who can deliver the most regenerative product to the market, the one that moms are racing to the market to buy, that are cleaning off shelves because they're like, that is a healthier product, that is fueling my kids more, that is creating a stronger connection to our food, to our land. I'm fine with that. I think we can, you know, I see no problem in I don't even say healthy competition, straight competition between food companies to deliver higher quality product. And again, that comes down to consumers saying, no, I'm not going to buy your product because it's not being sourced in the way I want it. How does regenerative agriculture compare to hydroponic? Well, hydroponic is water. You're not really using soil. So regenerative farming, and could you have a regenerative hydroponic farm is a question that I do not know the answer to, and I am going to find out the answer. But hydroponics is, you're putting, instead of the way that you would put fertilizers into soil, you're putting fertilizers into water, and you're really cutting out soil. I think that a lot of times hydroponics doesn't taste as good because, again, you get nutrients, you get taste from that soil. I also think there's a lot of systems that are doing it really well. You see a lot of greens, like salad greens, being grown that way. But Brenda, I'm now curious about that answer and whether or not you can be regenerative and hydroponic. So stay tuned. If you drop your email in the chat, I will find out an answer and I will get back to you on that one. Let me see what else. Oh, thank you for all these resources in Longmont. These are great. That's another really great way to, yes, we all buy the big brands at the grocery store because sometimes we don't have the choice, but buy the small brands, buy from the local grocers that maybe only have produce 6 months a year. In a former life, I ran farmers markets. I love farmers markets. Depending on the time of the year, you can get a lot of things from them. So that's a great way to vote with your dollar, to really advocate for the foods that you want to bring into your house, want to eat, want to, support. We've got a few minutes left. Does anybody have any other questions that they want to bring into this conversation? Or anything that I didn't answer for you? Brenda, I got your email. I'm going to find out about this hydroponics question. Sandy, go ahead.
So you go to a farmer's market, and how do you know how they're growing their crops? I mean, is there going to be something that they use as a logo or something that they can use at farmers markets?
Yeah, I mean, so farmers markets, folks selling, they can be USDA organic certified, just like anything else. Nothing that you're going to buy in a farmer's market is going to be a GMO. Well, the only crops that have GMO versions that you might buy at a farmer's market right now are apples. And most likely you're not going to see those at a farmer's market because they're really expensive to grow. And most small farmers are not going to be growing them. The best way to do it is ask the farmer or go find the tent of the people who are running the farmer's market and ask them what their standards are to let people into their farmer's market. I've definitely been at farmers markets and I'm like, oh, look, they have oranges. This is when I lived in DC. Oh, that's weird. And you pick it up and it's got a Sunkist sticker on it because they let people go to Costco, buy the big bags and sell them at the farmer's market.
Yeah,
that's not a farmer's market.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah. So the best advice, ask the people running the farmer's market what their standards are to let people in. Generally, most farmers markets are very proud that they are serving local farmers. I know in Colorado, you guys have some fabulous farmers markets. I always try to come during peach season so I can get Palisade peaches. And then, yes, I do ship them home with me to turn them into my grandmother's jam. You just have, it takes a little bit more work, but once you get it down and once you get to know your local farmers, once you get to know your local farmers markets, they're going to let you know what's coming. They're going to let you know that, oh my gosh, the strawberry crop this year is really good, but it's going to be 2 weeks delayed. So be here, in 2 weeks, be here early because we're going to have the good strawberries. Or, hey, it's looking like we're going to have a later harvest on this product. So maybe you don't need to, put as much away for winter or think this is your last week for tomatoes. We actually got a couple more weeks coming. The more you can get in tune with the local food scene, the more you're going to know about what's going on.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I'm a farmer in Colorado. I do a number of practices like a cover crop, don't plow, maybe some other things that are kind of regenerative practices. And I grow alfalfa in an arid environment like Colorado, which is getting versus time proceeds. Is that regenerative?
Yes, ma'am. Yeah. So so I think what Elaine's question is getting at this idea of some crops are considered really water intensive, and in places with less water, with more climate problems, is that still regenerative? Absolutely, because what you're focusing on is building that soil. What you're focusing on is using some resources, but building the resiliency of that overall soil so that it can keep growing. Being regenerative doesn't depend on what crop you grow or how many crops you grow. It is based solely off of the practices that you're using, the ways in which you're nurturing the soil, all coming together. Oh, Wes, you just asked my favorite question. Seed patenting, intellectual property rights over seeds. So let me tell you a story. My work, which is very, very rooted in regenerative now, when I joined Green America 7 years ago, as Christy mentioned, we were the non-GMO supply working group, and we were focused on not using GMOs. When I came in and they said, well, guys, you're talking about non-GMO as a proxy for soil health, because when you're not using patented seeds, when you're not using seeds that have been bred to do certain things, then you don't need to use the chemicals that go with those seeds. So those seeds can grow in certain ways. My whole network looked at me. They're like, well, yeah, we're talking about building soil health. I'm like, great, we're talking about regenerative. Because can you use patented seeds in a regenerative system? You can, but you're not going to want to, because patented seeds, like anything under patent, medications, vehicles, anything out there in the world, if it's under a patent, it's more expensive. Meanwhile, if you're using seeds that you've saved, or seeds that some farmers we know, they grow, they're having an off, let's say one of their crops is having an off year, well, they then grow their own seeds for the next year. So if you're just using seeds that have not been genetically engineered, and you don't have to use the corresponding chemicals so that they grow in the right way, it's a lot cheaper. It saves you a lot. So do I know regenerative farmers that are using some patented seeds some years? Yes. Because I also know some regenerative farmers that are still using a little bit of chemicals in their operations. Not a lot, but they're using a little bit of chemicals in certain areas. They're using a little bit of chemicals because their soil, they had a rough year and they need a little bit more health in their soil. That is still regenerative, because the goal is still to build the soil health. The goal is still to respect what the soil needs. This is not this year you're regenerative and next year you're not regenerative. It's, again, we're looking at a whole system change. We're looking at this whole mindset change. So everything that's going into this work is still considered to be regenerative. Joanne's got a last question in here on cutting down the transportation of food supplies beyond buying at farmers market and local. It's a great question, and that's a really hard question to answer, because we don't even have regional food systems anymore. We have a national food system, and in some ways, a global food system. Now, one way to support the relocalization of food is there's actually been a series of USDA grants that have gone out. They've split the country into 8 regional food hubs, and they are trying to relocalize some of those food supplies. That work is just beginning. So if you guys see it, all of the money is coming from federal USDA to your state departments of agriculture. If you guys see anything about that, jump on it, support it, help build those systems, because that's how we reduce those food miles. Sandra, I see your hand up. Oh, Sandra, you're still on mute, hon.
I'm thinking about soil. If I'm looking at soil in my garden, and I dig into it, what should I see? This is really basic, but what should I see that I know that I have healthy soil?
Bugs. If you see bugs, if you see worms, if you see if you see a lot of birds around your soil, that means there's stuff in there for them to eat. That means you have really healthy soil. If you have, let's say you get, I know that these, let's say it's the middle of June, you get one of those gnarly tornadoes that comes through Colorado with the wind and the hail, and it flattens everything in your garden. If after, the next day, after the sun has come out and it's all sunshiny, you see your plants that got knocked over by that hail, they all just start to stand back up. That means that you have really strong root structures. That means that once those plants dry out, their roots are able to pop them right back up.
Well, I mean, not just garden. I was just wondering, farmers can look at that without necessarily being tested, but
and there's you can also do a water compaction test where you literally take a ball, you scoop some soil up, you make like a soil ball, like you would a snowball, and you pour some water over it. If all of that water runs off the soil, that is not healthy soil. If that soil soaks up that water and holds it, that's some good soil. You can also just look at the color. The first time I landed in Iowa, you're landing into Des Moines, you look out the window, there's black stuff all over the ground. I'm like, what on earth is this? And someone next to me is like, you silly woman, that soil. I'm like, no, 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 no. I'm a farmer. I'm from Colorado. That's not what my soil looks like. The darker the soil, the more good stuff is in there, the healthier it is. Not only, the bugs and the worms you can see, but the yummy little microorganisms and the root systems and all of that. That's what makes that soil dark. So the dark, honestly, look at your soil color. You drive by a farm and you see that really dark, beautiful, sort of brownie like soil. That's good soil. And if they've got a farmer's market on that land, just stop and buy whatever they have, because it is going to be delicious. That's another really good way, and I know we're running almost up on time, is when you're buying from a farmer's market, buying local, buying at a roadside stand, you can taste what has been grown in good soil, because it tastes better. Your strawberries taste better. Your green beans taste better. It all is so much more delicious when it's come from healthier soil. Sandy.
Sandy brought up the garden, and I was wondering if we should all have our gardens tested to see like would you have your soil tested if you had just a garden instead of a farm?
I wouldn't, because the beauty of a garden is what you're putting into your garden. You know what's going on in there. Take a look at it. Christy dropped the link in the chat. Green America has our Climate Victory Gardens, which is exactly, the same victory gardens that our grandparents and great grandparents grew during World War I, during World War II. We're just, instead of focused on, feeding ourselves for a war effort, we're focused on feeding ourselves for a climate effort. And so when you look at your garden soil, if it's nice and dark and it looks like brownie batter, that's really good soil. If stuff's growing really well in it, that's really healthy soil. You can, within your garden, you keep track of what's going on, which I know all gardeners do. So just sort of, keep track of it. You can also find your local master gardeners group, because they can also talk to you a little bit more about garden specific stuff.
They like chemicals, don't they?
Oh.
Master gardeners,
do they?
Yeah, I think so.
Oh, well, that's heartbreaking.
I mean, I don't know that for a fact. I just assume that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. That's a great question. You should ask them that question. If they say, oh yeah, use chemicals, you should ask them why. Jane, are there tax breaks for those who practice regenerative agriculture? No, we actually punish regenerative farmers in this country as federal ag policy. I can, if you want to dive more into the Farm Bill, let me know. I am happy to come back and talk about this. We do a lot of policy. Well, I do a lot of policy work because I worked on Capitol Hill for a number of years and I love it. No, federal and generally state agricultural policy is built around monocropping, one of the big 6 crops. So corn, soy, wheat, cotton, peanuts, rice, because that's what we think we need to grow to feed people. And we are not focused on growing quality. We are focused on growing quantity, which is why we have things like corn syrup, which is why we have things like ethanol, because we had a lot of corn, we had to figure out what to do with it rather than figuring out something else to grow. So no, what we need to be advocating for is changes to federal ag policy that actually support regenerative farmers, that reduce, so federal policy is, if you want to get federal crop insurance on your land, you have to terminate anything growing on that land chemically 45 to 60 days before you plant. So they don't want you to be growing cover crops. They do not want you to be growing multiple crops on a land. And that is something that we need to change in federal legislation, which really is all Farm Bill related.
Wow.
I see Jane's hand and I see Sanders' hand. I feel like Jane's telling us we need to stop talking.
No, actually, I would like to hand over, because the only thing you have to do at the end of this is stop the recording and close out of the meeting. And since it's 5, Elaine, would you be able to close out of the meeting?
Yeah,
I know this meeting goes till 6, but
You can do it, Elaine.
right. Yeah, I think our time's up for today, but I just want to thank both Christy and Jessica. This is a wonderful presentation, and remind everybody that this will go, the recording will go up on the League's YouTube site. So please share it. with other members and friends. Try to get the word out. And again, thank you and thank everyone for tuning in for today's presentation.
Thank you all so much. Reach out if you have more questions.
Thank you.
And I will close out the meeting. You all have a wonderful night.
Thanks, Jane. You
Thank you.
too.